Ken and Joy, thank you very much. And any of the children who'd like to leave for their time now can go with Sharon and have a great Easter experience at their age level this morning as well. It was the psychologist Carl Jung who speculated that how somebody responds in a word association exercise might reveal something about their character. Now, we are here today to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus and not try to evaluate all of our characters, but I do want to do one word association with you this morning, and I'm going to ask you to think of what one word comes to your mind when you hear the word Easter. What word do you associate with Easter? I'm not sure what it says about my character, but I think there's been one word for Easter that has been really a part of my thinking ever since I was a very young child, and that's the word new. N-E-W. I'd like to think it's because there's some deep theological thinking or reasoning for me thinking that way, but I think what it really comes down to is growing up in my parents' house, at Easter, we always got new clothes. For instance, take a look at this picture, okay? This is my brother and sisters, and if you don't know, I'm the cute one in the plaid suit in the middle, okay? I was making a stunning statement, okay, about fashion then. And if you notice, my sister Denise was trying to imitate, okay, my fashion cunning there. But in addition to getting new clothes on Easter, oftentimes we would get something else new. And this particular Easter, I got 2 bunnies. Okay, not just one, but I got 2 bunnies that were around our house for a long time. I remember having those bunnies. I think they were the only rabbits associated with our house that ever died of old age. Okay, I think that's just how long we had those. That I had those bunnies. I realize that not everyone thinks this way, but when it comes to purchasing things, I think most of us are inclined to buy something that's new instead of old things. If our budgets afford it, or if we can afford it in our budgets, we'll probably want to buy a new car compared to a car that, say, has 200,000 miles on it. We like the smell of new. We like the feel of new. But you know what? There's something to be said for restoring old things and making them like new. This winter, I decided to try a new hobby. I decided to walk in my boss's footsteps and see how it goes, okay? My boss being Jesus. I think most of us would know that Jesus' dad, Joseph, was a carpenter. He was a woodworker. And most people believe that Jesus probably spent some time with him in the wood shop, making new things, as well as reviving or renewing old things. And because I had this abundant supply chain in my yard, okay, I decided that I'm going to try the hobby of woodworking. It started with what you might call a renewal project, okay? Before we tore down my mom and dad's house, we salvaged some of the boards out of that house, okay? I went and I got some of the floorboards out of the kitchen and the dining room. And I dragged them all the way to Connecticut, okay, which is where we were living at the time. And then when we moved back here, I dragged them all the way back here. I knew I wanted to do something with them. I wanted to give some new life to these boards that were a part of a house that when I grew up was already 100 years old. I wanted to find out if there was something that I could make that would give them a new life and a new purpose. Well, what I ended up with was this headboard that you see for our bedroom. And my wife can tell you it took me forever to get it done. But we do like how it turned out, where you can see that, the beauty of the wood. There's no staining that was done there. It was just finished. It was just that life that was there was brought out of it. Well, that project made me want to try to make something new. So I started cutting and slabbing and planting or planing and jointing and finishing some of just the natural wood that was lying around our house. In fact, just last week, I finished a desk where I actually jointed together some boards that I had cut from one of the trees that I had cut down early in the process, and I joined them together using biscuits. I don't know if you've ever done that before, but what I learned was it's a lot easier eating biscuits than it is trying to joint boards and make it look good. But I'm pleased with how it turned out. It's an elevating desk that I think will work great in our house. I love how it looks. I love the design of the wood. I love the life and the newness that it brings to our home. I've also got some other projects in the works that I look forward to making some more new things. And if something comes along, like those floorboards for my parents' house, I'd like to restore some of those things as well. You know, as we celebrate Easter this morning, I want us to focus on the fact that Jesus' resurrection gives us new life. I want to begin by reading John's account from his gospel of some of the things. They weren't everything that happened on that first Easter morning, but I want to read John's account out of John chapter 20, and I invite you to read along with me. I'll be reading from the New Living Translation this morning, and let's just hear and let's just see some of the things that happened that first Easter Sunday morning. John says this in John chapter 20, verse 1. He says, "Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one that Jesus loved." That's John, okay? John, who's writing this, refers to himself as the one that Jesus loved. And Mary said to him, "They have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." Peter and the other disciple started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He stopped and looked in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. He also noticed the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For until then, they still hadn't understood the scriptures that had said Jesus must rise from the dead. Then they went home. I love how John says about himself at the end of verse 8, he saw and believed. It was one of those moments when that light just comes on inside your head. I call it aha moments. It's when things have been confusing in the past and they just don't make any sense, but all of a sudden, boom, you have your aha moment and everything just makes sense and it falls into place. I think John's aha moment was that Jesus was actually alive. He was no longer dead. The scriptures had talked about it. Jesus himself had talked about it. But until John saw the empty tomb, he had trouble believing that anybody could experience new life. What did it or will it take for you to believe that new life is possible? Let's read on in John's account of what happened that Sunday morning. John chapter 20, verse 11 says this. Mary, after she ran and got them, she must have come back to the tomb because Mary was standing outside the tomb crying. And as she wept, she stooped and looked in. For John, all it took was a look. All it took was him to look in and see that there was no dead body. But for Mary, that doesn't appear to be enough, because let's keep reading. It says in verse 12, she saw two white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her. "Because they've taken away my Lord," she replied, "and I don't know where they put him." Her response shows that she still didn't understand that new life is possible. She didn't understand that Jesus had done exactly what he said he was going to do. You see, in her mind, someone had moved Jesus' body. She had come there that morning prepared to do something, which was to prepare his body to stay in that place for all of eternity. And now that body was gone, what's she going to do? You see, she still didn't believe that new life was possible. So verse 14 says this, she turned to leave and saw someone standing there, and it was Jesus. But she didn't recognize him. How could she not recognize Jesus? She spent so much time with him. He'd done so much for her. How could she not know that that man standing right there before her was Jesus? Now, there's a lot of speculation on a lot of people, that there's some psychological reasons why she couldn't recognize him. And I'm not going to go to that path this morning. I just want us to say that even seeing the resurrected Jesus didn't allow Mary to connect the dots. But we read on. Dear woman, why are you crying? Jesus asked her. Who are you looking for? And John says, she thought he was the gardener. I love that phrase. She thought he was the gardener. What was he doing? Wearing overalls and a baseball cap? I mean, why would she think that? She couldn't recognize him. She couldn't see the holes in his hands from where 2 days earlier nails had been driven through them. She didn't recognize his voice when he asked her why she was crying and who she was looking for. The answer to those questions were no. Because listen to what she says next. She says, sir, if you've taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go get him. I love how she calls Jesus sir. It's the same word that we get the word Lord from. And in this particular in context, it means the one who has ownership or the responsibility for someone else. You see, she really thought he was the gardener. She thought he was the one who was responsible for the garden in which this tomb was located, and he had done something with Jesus' body. She still couldn't believe. She still couldn't believe, like John, that new life was possible. But then this happens. I love it. Mary, Jesus says. Now, we don't know how Jesus said her name. We don't know what tone he used. Was there a little bit of exasperation in Jesus' voice because she didn't recognize him? Could it have been Mary? Or was there a little bit of a more stern tone in his voice to try to snap her out of this fog that she was feeling? Said, Mary! Or was there just something that Jesus knew that he had shared her name before in some maybe tender and loving way where he said, Mary? That he knew she would recognize him? Whatever tone he said it in, look at what happened next. She turned to him and she cried out, Rabboni, which in Hebrew means teacher. The word that Mary uses there is a title of honor. It's the highest title of honor that you could give to a master teacher. It wasn't until the moment that Mary heard Jesus say her name that she believed and called him her beloved master. If we read on, her first instinct was probably what most of us would have done too. She wanted to give Jesus a hug. She just wanted to go and just wrap her arms around him and say, Jesus, man, it's good to see you. But for some reason, Jesus said, nope, not yet. There was something about his resurrected human body that still had to take place before he could come into contact with other human bodies. And so she just had to leave that place. Jesus had told her to tell the rest of the disciples something, and the scripture says that she went and did that. But here's what I think. I think she started processing this question, which is, what does it mean that Jesus was dead and now he's alive? I think the whole time she walked back home, I think she's thinking, what does this mean? And I think for any of us today who are willing to ponder the same question, I think we need to ask ourselves, what does it mean to me that Jesus arose from the dead? You see, if we're like Mary and John, and we believe that Jesus rose from the dead, there are just so many implications to our life. Perhaps the greatest, though, is that we've been given new life. And it changes just about everything in our lives. The story is told of a ponytailed, tattooed biker who ended up in a Sunday morning worship service in a small conservative town in rural Indiana. I've been in some of those, and I guarantee you there are some pretty conservative churches there. To say that he stood out would be a pretty gross understatement, but you know what? Over time, the church just loved him and accepted him, and he became a Christ follower. People noticed, though, that even on the hottest days of summer, this man would continue to wear long sleeves. And one day the pastor just couldn't resist any longer, so he looked at him and he said, "Hey, buddy, why is it even on the hottest days of the summer that you're wearing long sleeves?" And the man blushed a little bit, and then he confessed. He goes, "Well, I've got a tattoo of a naked lady on my arm. And I didn't want the other people in the church to have to look at that." And the pastor said, "Oh, I understand. I understand. Thank you for that consideration." It was a few weeks later that this man came into church. He looked the pastor up and he said, "Pastor, I really want you to see my tattoo." The pastor said, remembering what he had said earlier, "That's okay. I don't need to see that tattoo." He goes, No, I want you to see my tattoo. Because now that I'm following Christ, I want everything to change and everything to be new. So I went to the tattoo artist and I had him put clothes on her. And sure enough, as he rolled up the sleeve, there was the tattoo with this woman who now had clothes on. You see, new life can change every part of our lives. I think for most of us, as we think about new life and the new beginnings, we think about springtime. I really don't think it was an accident that God timed the Old Testament Passover and Jesus' crucifixion and his resurrection to happen in the springtime of the year. Because springtime is when we experience new life. Even like this year, if it takes longer sometimes for everything to get out of the ground, springtime is when we experience new life. Margaret Alt was completing her PhD at Duke University, and she fell in love with another student there by the name of Hyung Kim. Shortly after they started dating, Hyung told her that he was HIV positive. And this was back in the days before the drugs had really been developed that gave hope to those people who had that diagnosis. So both of them knew that there was only going to be a limited amount of time that they were going to be able to spend together. But they both decided they wanted to get married and enjoy every moment that God gave to them. Both of them loved walking through the gardens on the campus of Duke University. They would walk through the gardens and just admire the different types of plants and the bushes and the flowers that would bloom. It was during what turned out to be their last spring together that they really took their time and enjoyed each and every plant and the beauty in that garden. Turns out that later that fall was when Hyung died. In her book, Sing Me to Heaven, Margaret Alt wrote about how they had spent so much time in the gardens at Duke, the administration decided to plant a special rose garden in memory and celebration of Hyung's life. It was early the next spring after Hyung had died that she went to see the gardens and then to see the rose garden that was being planted. I want you to listen how she describes that particular visit. She said, where peonies were promised, or where they had been the year before, where peonies were promised, there were only the dead stumps of last year's stalks. Where daylilies were promised, there was only unpresupposing tufts of foliage. Where hostas were promised, there was nothing at all. And yet I know what lushness lay below the surface. Those beds that were so brown and empty, and to the unknowing eye so unpromising, would be full to bursting in a matter of months. You see, what she knew was, even though as she walked through the gardens in the early spring and it looked dead, that there was life waiting to come out of that ground and to burst into bloom. She goes on to ask, I think, the same type of question that I was asking earlier about what does it mean for us that Jesus Christ rose from the dead? I want you to hear her question. She said this, is this whole world like this? Is this what it might be like to live in expectation? Real expectation of the resurrection? What does it mean that we live with the hope of new life? So far, I like woodworking. I like being able to bring old things into a new life. I like creating new things. But you know what? The best illustration for resurrection is gardening. It really is. As you walked up to the doors this morning, you probably noticed that the plants were starting to come out of the ground, maybe a little later than normal, but they were starting to emerge out of the ground. And you know what? In just a few days, trees will be blossoming and flowers will be blooming, and there's going to be no question that the earth is coming back to life. This morning, I want to remind you that there's a new life available for all of us. You know, there might be some who are feeling like they're the ones who are lying in the tomb this morning. Maybe certain decisions that really looked good and sounded good when we made them have turned into something that have only sucked the life out of us. And now we are the zombies who are walking around like the Walking Dead. I've watched enough of that series to realize that there really isn't much difference between the zombies and the reapers. In many cases, I think the living, quote unquote, are in need as much new life as the zombies. For instance, I think Leah and Daryl may look normal on the outside, but on the inside, what they really need is new life. Just as much as those grotesque-looking zombies need new life. Over the years, I've met a lot of people who've looked great on the outside. But on the inside, man, they're as dead as people buried in the cemetery. You don't notice it at first because they're really good at faking it. But deep down inside, and once you get to know them, you can hear them say, sometimes without even saying it, what I need is a new life. Jake was a young man that I met a few years ago. And man, on the outside, he looked great. He looked normal as could be. He was married. He had a beautiful young daughter. He was starting his own business. He was a salesman. He had a great personality. But Jake was addicted to alcohol. And the more I got to know him, the more I was convinced he was a member of the Walking Dead. You see, he would numb himself to sleep with a drink. He would wake up in the morning with a drink to help him get started. And many times we would talk, and I would ask him, Jake, how you doing? He said, oh, things are doing great. And he'd give me all these things. And you know what? I found out he was lying about all of that. Because before the age of 45, I did Jake's funeral because he died of alcohol poisoning. He never fully embraced the new life that Jesus wanted to give to him. And I can't tell you how many times I've prayed that deep down inside his heart, God saw something that nobody else could see, that showed that he believed in the resurrected Jesus. And my hope and prayer is that he somehow will experience new life in heaven. I really pray that everyone who hears this message remembers that there's no need to remain dead when there's new life that's been made available to us. Look at these verses that the Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. He says this, if anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. He's a new person. He has new life. The old is gone, the new has come. All of this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation, that God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting men's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though Christ were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Let me simplify it this way by just saying to be reconciled is to be given new life. It's like those old floorboards in my parents' house. They could have been cast into the fire and burned like a lot of other things, but instead they were given a new purpose. This morning, God has given every one of us a new purpose. Some of us have found it, and others haven't. Because some of us believe and others haven't. So here's my question that I want you to ponder this morning. What will it take for you to be like John and Mary and fully believe in the resurrected Jesus? Will just hearing that the tomb is empty be enough for you? Or will it take Jesus saying your name? If you're willing to listen, let me say this. Jesus is saying your name. He's calling you by name because he wants you to know that he's not in the tomb. He's alive. He's been given new life. And more than anything, Jesus wants to give us new life. Can you hear him calling your name this morning? Can you hear Jesus calling you? I don't know what word you associated with Easter when earlier in the message I asked you to do that word association. But I sure hope from now on when you think about that day that Jesus rose from the dead, that the word new comes to mind. And maybe, just maybe, that word will have some impact on your character. See, Jesus brings us new life. And with new life comes a new hope, a new attitude. So if you're listening this morning and are tired of feeling more dead than alive, let me just invite you to hear Jesus say your name. And let me invite you to accept the gift of life that Jesus wants to give to you. I'm going to invite our worship team up to lead us in a song, and I just want you to be thinking about where you are this morning in your belief of the resurrected Christ. Have you heard him call your name? Have you responded to that? And have you believed? Maybe just hearing Scripture is enough for you to say, you know what? I believe that. That's like John. That's great. But I think probably most of us are more like Mary, who we've kept going our direction and we kept doing the things that we thought we needed to do. I mean, Mary went to the tomb thinking that her job was to anoint Jesus' body for burial. What are you going to do now, Mary? He's alive. My question to you this morning is, what are you going to do now? Because Jesus is alive. Let's sing.